When a veteran tries to leave his war medal at a pawn shop, the clerk mocks it as scrap. The old man leaves in silence, but someone outside heard everything. Seconds later, an enraged ex-SEAL kicks the door down. Because that medal wasn't just history, it was a warning, and the past just came back. The bell above the pawn shop door gave a weak jingle, barely catching the attention of the young clerk hunched over his phone. An elderly man stepped inside, the collar of his faded army jacket turned up against the cold. He clutched something in his fist, not tightly but with reverence, like you might hold a photo of someone long gone. His name was Henry. No last name offered, no pleasantries. He simply placed the item on the glass counter and gave a quiet, "You're dead." The clerk leaned in, unimpressed. It was a tarnished medal, its ribbon frayed and colors dulled by time. He squinted at it, then scoffed. "This," he muttered. "Not even real gold, it's scrap." He let the medal drop onto the counter with a clink that sounded louder than it should have. Henry didn't flinch. He just reached out, picked it up again, and nodded once more, not to the clerk, but to himself. Then he turned and walked out without a word. Across the street, standing beside a beat-up Ford pickup, a man in his late 40s watched the entire scene unfold. His name was Cole Strickland, broad-shouldered, sun-worn face, and the kind of stillness in his posture that hinted at years of discipline under fire. He didn't know the old man, but he knew the medal, and he knew what it cost to earn one. Then he heard the word scrap. The door of the pawn shop hadn't even closed all the way when Cole moved. 5 strides, 1 breath, then crack. The door slammed open so hard the glass spidered and fell in shards. The clerk barely had time to raise his head before Cole was at the counter, eyes locked, voice low and burning. "You don't talk about that medal like that. Not ever." And in that moment, in that still, trembling second, the shop wasn't just a dingy storefront anymore. It was a battleground. Not because of violence, but because the past had walked in wearing boots, and it refused to stay buried. The bus ride home was quiet, just the hum of tires and the occasional cough from the driver. Henry sat in the middle row, medal tucked deep in his coat pocket, as if the wind might steal it. The streets of Albany passed in a blur, gas stations, shuttered laundromats, a bakery with a chalkboard sign that hadn't changed in weeks. Nothing looked different, but something inside him had shifted. He got off 2 blocks early, walking the rest of the way down Lincoln Avenue, where the houses leaned slightly, as though weary from too many New York winters. His porch creaked as he stepped onto it. Same as always, the same creak he remembered hearing the night before he left for Vietnam. He opened the door to silence. No dog, no television, just the ticking of a wall clock that hadn't kept time properly in years. Henry's home was lived in, not cluttered. Photos lined the mantel, a black and white of a woman in a wedding dress, a boy holding a paper plane, a group of young men in fatigues, standing shoulder to shoulder, all sunburned and smiling. Most of them were gone now. Time took some, war took the rest. He sat in the worn recliner by the window, medal resting on his thigh. His fingers traced the edges, not polishing it, just feeling its weight. It wasn't valuable, not in dollars. That much the pawn clerk got right. But the value wasn't in the metal. It was in the silence, the things no one ever asked about and he never volunteered to say. Henry hadn't always been quiet. In '68, he could shout louder than the rotor blades of a Huey. He had opinions, dreams. He'd been engaged once, too. To the girl in the photo, Evelyn. But that version of him stayed somewhere overseas. The man who returned wore the same face, but moved through life like he was walking underwater. A part of him had stayed on the jungle floor, waiting to be found. He hadn't told anyone why he went to the pawn shop that morning, not even his niece, who called every Sunday. He hadn't wanted money, he just didn't want to die with that medal sitting in a box, forgotten. Maybe someone would see it, wonder, maybe even care enough to ask where it came from. That was all. He wanted not to be remembered, but to not be erased. The house creaked again, but not from the wind. Henry looked toward the back door. Nothing. Just the sound of age and memory shifting in old wood. Still, something in his gut whispered a warning. He stood, slow and stiff, placed the medal back inside its case, and locked it in the drawer under the bookshelf. His breath caught for a moment, like it used to before going over a ridge. The feeling wasn't gone. After all these years, it still crept in. That tension before something starts. And in that still room, without realizing why, Henry whispered aloud for the first time in weeks, "He's coming." He didn't know who, not yet, but some things. A soldier just feels. Cole Strickland had never been good at minding his own business. Maybe it was the years overseas, training himself to watch everything, notice what others missed. Or maybe it was just how he was wired. Either way, when he saw the old man walk into that shop with trembling hands and eyes that had seen too much, something in Cole's gut went tight. He hadn't intended to stop. He'd just finished a tire rotation for a regular and was locking up the garage early. A cold coffee in one hand, key ring in the other. But when Henry stepped through that pawn shop door, Cole paused mid-sip. Not for the man exactly, but for the object he carried. Even from across the street, Cole could tell it wasn't just a medal. It was that medal. A bronze star, if he wasn't mistaken, maybe with a V for valor. He'd seen them handed out, in sandstorms, in barracks lit by flickering fluorescent lights, and in folded flags handed to widows. They never looked like much, but they carried more than metal. They carried ghosts. When the clerk laughed, loud enough that it echoed across the cracked pavement, Cole felt something snap. He didn't know Henry's name, didn't need to. What mattered was that someone had called a man sacrifice, scrap. And you don't walk away from that. After the door cracked, after the clerk stumbled back with eyes wide, Cole hadn't laid a finger on him. He didn't need to. His presence was enough. Words came sharp, low, edged like a combat knife. "You ever see what it takes to earn one of those?" Cole said, voice nearly shaking. "You ever clean blood out of the grooves of that ribbon?" The clerk had nothing, not a sound. Cole walked out before the man could recover, back across the street, where the cold air bit at his neck. He wasn't proud of the scene. He hadn't lost his temper in years. But this wasn't about anger. It was about something deeper, a rage made of respect and regret and the unbearable weight of memory. That night, he couldn't sleep. The old man's face stayed in his head. The way he walked, hunched but proud, like every step carried more than just his body. Cole pulled out an old shoebox from under his bed, one he hadn't touched in 6 years. Inside were letters, patches, and one medal of his own, still stained on the back with someone else's blood. He stared at it a long while before reaching for his laptop. He didn't know where to start, but he typed in the basics. Albany, Vietnam veteran. Bronze. Star. Pawn shop. Nothing useful. Still, something in his gut told him the story wasn't done. He closed the laptop and leaned back, eyes to the ceiling. Then a thought hit him. Not a memory, but a pattern. That medal. It had something unusual, a faint engraving on the rim, one he hadn't seen since Kandahar, and just like that, Cole realized something terrifying. That medal wasn't just a memory, it was a message. The next morning, Cole was already at his workbench by 6, the shop lights casting long shadows over scattered tools and engine parts. But he wasn't focused on carburetors or cracked fan belts. His mind was stuck 2 decades back, to a dry, stinging wind and the red dust of a place he'd sworn never to think about again. Kandahar, 2004. His unit had been ambushed just before dawn. 3 Humvees down. They'd radioed for extraction, but no one came. Hours passed. Cole remembered pressing gauze against a friend's neck while gunfire rang like nails against a steel drum. They were told later It was a miscommunication. Fog of war, the officer said, but Cole knew better. It was a decision. Someone, somewhere, had decided they weren't worth it that day. That memory had stayed with him, not just as trauma, but as a riddle, an unanswered question that gnawed at him in quiet moments. And now, a medal showing up with a similar pattern of abandonment. His instincts screamed louder than logic. He left the garage early and drove across town to the public library, the only place he knew that still had newspaper archives and real quiet. He didn't even know the old man's name, but he remembered the medal's design. With some help from a librarian named Joyce, who didn't ask questions but clearly wanted to, he pulled up archived military award registries and local obituaries. Hours passed. Then, buried in a 1971 military commendation note in a local paper, he found it. Sergeant Henry K. Dorsey, awarded Bronze Star with valor for actions in Phu Bai, South Vietnam. No photo, just the name. Cole leaned back, mind racing. He scribbled, the address listed, outdated, but maybe a start. Then something else caught his eye. Below Henry's name in the same unit was another, Lieutenant Charles A. Maddox, MIA. He recognized that name, not from Vietnam, from a government white paper he'd skimmed years ago about lost patrols and sealed missions. Maddox was believed dead. No body, no witnesses, except maybe Henry. Cole stepped out into the cold, heart hammering in his chest. He didn't know exactly what he was chasing yet. But it was no longer just about respect. It was about truth, an unfinished business that smelled far too much like the kind that got men silenced. As he walked back to his truck, an old man in a trench coat passed by, brushing shoulders with him. Cole turned instinctively. Nothing strange, except for one detail. The man was wearing an army ring that looked brand new. Too new. Cole watched him disappear into the crowd, his gut tightening. Something told him Henry wasn't the only ghost. Walking around Albany, Cole knew he couldn't untangle this alone. So he made a call to someone who had helped him once before, back when he was still figuring out how to breathe as a civilian. Nancy Reeve, former journalist, semi-retired but still sharp as glass. She'd spent decades digging up truths no one wanted told, and she had a soft spot for veterans who couldn't shake the war off their backs. They met at her home, a cozy two-story in Rensselaer with wind chimes that played off-key. Inside, the place smelled like cinnamon and old paper. Nancy, grey streaks framing her cheekbones and reading glasses on a chain, listened as Cole laid it all out. The pawn shop, the medal, Henry Dorsey, and the strange engraving around the edge. He showed her a rough sketch he'd made from memory. It wasn't just a serial number, he said. It had an extra digit at the end, looked like an asterisk or maybe a symbol. Nancy leaned closer, eyes narrowing. You sure it wasn't just worn down? No, Cole said. It was intentional. It reminded me of the tags used in blackfile ops, stuff that's not even supposed to exist. Nancy nodded slowly, then disappeared into her study. When she came back, she was holding a dusty binder, labeled Concordia. Inside were clippings, scribbled notes, military communiques from the late 60s and 70s, most redacted or fragmentary. I was working on this in the 90s, she said. A story about a classified operation that vanished after 2 men were left behind in Laos. It was pulled before I could publish. Pressure came from Washington. Hard. Cole flipped through. The pages. Concordia, he asked. Not the official name, just a nickname I gave it, but the unit matches Dorsey's records. And look here. She pointed to a blurry copy of an award document. At the bottom, partially visible through blacked out lines, was a medal number with the exact same extra marking. They looked at each other, a silent current of dread passing between them. If Henry still has that medal, Nancy said, it's not just a token, it's a marker, a signal to someone, or a reminder. And if it's surfacing now after all these years, Someone might be looking for it, Cole exhaled. Then we need to talk to Henry. Nancy hesitated, then added quietly, if he's still safe. Cole's jaw tightened. He hadn't thought of that. He picked up his phone and dialed the number. He'd found through a public registry. It rang and rang. Then a voice, but it wasn't Henry, it was a recording. This number is no longer in service. Cole's chest tightened, and for the first time since Kandahar, he felt real fear. Nancy poured them both coffee, her hands steady, but her eyes distant. Outside, the wind rustled the maple leaves like whispers against the windows. Cole sat across from her at the old kitchen table, flipping through more of her research. Newspaper clippings, old microfiche scans, scribbled annotations. The deeper he looked, the more his stomach twisted. You ever get close to publishing this? He asked. Nancy gave a dry laugh. Twice. First time my editor got a visit from a Department of Defense liaison. Next time, it was a phone call from someone who wouldn't give a name, just a message. Drop the story or we'll drop your source. I was 32 and scared. Cole looked up. But you kept the file. I kept everything, she said, because I knew I'd regret it if I didn't. And maybe, deep down, I was waiting for someone like you to show up. He didn't know how to respond to that, so he went back to the notes. Nancy had traced several soldiers connected to Concordia, and most had ended up either dead under vague circumstances or completely untraceable. Then there was a name he hadn't seen before, Latin Maddox's driver. Private First Class Louis Fife Rayburn, presumed KIA, no body recovered. Cole blinked. Rayburn? I've heard that name. Nancy leaned in. Where? He hesitated, then said, he was listed in a debrief from my own unit, Kandahar again. His name came up during an intelligence briefing on ghost protocols. Nobody knew what that meant, but it was marked continuity risk. I didn't think much of it then. Nancy's expression darkened. If this is the same man, then it means someone in the Pentagon was tracking him decades after Vietnam, which means they knew he wasn't dead. Cole sat back, shaken. His thoughts drifted to Henry. If this old man was the last living witness to whatever went down in that jungle, then keeping that medal wasn't just about honor, it was protection. Nancy saw the guilt in his face and didn't ask. She didn't need to. Cole had been carrying it long before this day, the weight of surviving when others didn't, of coming home intact in body, but not in soul. He'd spent years convincing himself the war was done. But it wasn't. Not really. I should have gone after him sooner, he said quietly. Nancy looked at him. You still can. Just then, a buzz came from Nancy's front door, the old intercom speaker crackling. She frowned. I'm not expecting anyone. She pressed the button. Yes? Silence. Then static. Then a voice. You're asking? The wrong questions, Ms. Reeve. Stop digging. Some medals are better left buried. The intercom went dead. Cole was already on his feet, hand reaching instinctively for the place where his sidearm used to be. He didn't have a weapon, but something told him they'd just become targets. Cole didn't bother knocking. He parked half a block away and walked up Henry's porch like he had every right in the world to be there, like a man who knew time was running out. The house was quiet, just like before. But this time, the front window was cracked open a half-inch, and inside the curtains barely moved. Cole raised his hand and knocked, once, twice, then he heard it. The slow shuffle of footsteps inside. The door creaked open, just wide enough for a pale eye and the edge of a face. You again, Henry muttered. Cole nodded. You didn't answer your phone. I never do. Henry started to close the door, but Cole stepped forward. Not aggressive, just firm. Someone's watching you. That stopped him. 5 minutes later, they sat in the living room. The air was heavy with dust and memories. Henry didn't offer coffee, didn't offer excuses either. He just sat in the Recliner, hands folded, eyes on the floor. Cole broke the silence. Operation Concordia, I know what it was. I just don't know why it disappeared. Henry didn't move, but something behind his eyes flickered. You were there, Cole said, weren't you? Henry sighed. Long and slow, like it had been waiting decades to get out. They told us it was a rescue mission, he began, voice dry as parchment. 3 Americans, pinned near Pubai. Intel said minimal resistance, but it was a setup. We walked right into an ambush. Half my unit didn't even fire their first round. He paused. The clock ticked on. I watched Maddox take a bullet. To the chest. Rayburn was dragged into the trees, screaming. We called for evac. Nothing. Radio silence. For 12 hours we held position while men bled out around us. Then, someone finally answered. Not command, not rescue, just a single phrase. Henry looked up, meeting Cole's eyes. Protocol Black initiated. That's all they said. Cole swallowed. He'd heard those words before, whispered in dark corners of military briefings. It was code for total abandonment. A mission scrubbed from the books. Survivors denied. I kept the medal, Henry continued, because it was the only proof I had that it happened. The serial number's real, but that mark, that was added by Maddox, said if anything ever happened, we'd know. Cole leaned forward. Know what? Henry hesitated, then stood, slow but steady. He walked to a bookshelf, pulled out a hidden panel, and retrieved a second item, a dog tag, scorched and bent, but still legible. Not his, it read, Rayburn LV. He's not dead, Henry said. He never was. And that medal, it's how they track us, how they know who's still talking. Cole stared at the tag in his palm. Then the house phone rang. Henry didn't own a phone. They both froze. 1 ring, 2, then silence. Nancy had always believed that if you pulled hard enough, every thread led somewhere. Sometimes it led to another dead end. Sometimes to a buried truth. And sometimes, if you weren't careful, to people who didn't want to be found. Back at her house, the silence from the strange phone call still hung in the air, like fog. But fear wasn't new to her. She'd faced it before, just never with this kind of weight. She called in a favor from a friend at a Veterans Affairs archive in D.C., a man she'd once dated long enough ago that his guilt still answered. Her calls, she gave him a name, Senator Clifford R. Mendenhall. The records tied him loosely to the Pentagon's Intelligence Committee during the late 60s, but most of his early career had been scrubbed clean. No mention of his time in uniform. No details about his role in Southeast Asia. Just glowing language about patriotism, integrity, and decades of service. But one detail cracked the illusion. Mendenhall had once commanded the intelligence unit stationed closest to Pubai during the exact month of Operation Concordia, and according to Nancy's contact, he'd signed off on 2 missions, now sealed under executive privilege, one of them matching the date Henry had given. That wasn't coincidence. Nancy drove straight to Cole's shop, finding him under the hood of a Chevy with more rust than paint. She tossed the folder onto his workbench. Mendenhall was there, she said. He approved the mission, and he buried it. Cole scanned the pages, jaw tight. He's still active? Retired. Living like royalty in a gated community upstate. Gives speeches about honor and sacrifice. Cole said nothing, but his grip on the folder tightened. Back at Henry's house, the old man was having a harder time. After the silent call, his nerves were frayed. He stared out the window for hours, half expecting headlights to pull into his driveway. The dog tag sat on the table in front of him like a curse. Then a letter arrived, hand-delivered, no postage. Just a single sheet inside, 1 sentence. You were warned. He didn't tell Cole, not yet, because for the first time in 50 years, Henry had a choice to make. He could stay quiet and keep breathing, or speak, and finally bury the lie. And somewhere, in a house with cameras at every gate and a staff that kept the real world out, Senator Mendenhall watched an old VHS tape of his own testimony, rehearsing the same false story he'd told for decades, until a red light blinked on his desk phone. he answered. A voice on the other end said, "Sir, someone's asking about Concordia." And for the first time in years, Mendenhall's hand trembled. The envelope arrived in Nancy's mailbox at sunrise. No stamp, no return address, just her name, printed neatly, almost delicately, as if the sender wanted to be polite about the threat. She didn't open it right away. Her fingers paused on the seal. The quiet around her house felt different that morning, not peaceful but empty, like something had stepped back just far enough to stay out of sight. Inside, the envelope was a photocopy of an article she had written in 1993, never published. It detailed the whispers of Operation Concordia and hinted at political interference. Alongside it was a torn photo, an old black and white showing 5 soldiers. One face was circled in red, Henry, written in neat block letters across the bottom. Some debts stay buried for a reason. Nancy didn't call the police. She called Cole. He showed up within the hour, eyes scanning her property before he even crossed the threshold. "They're not trying to scare you," he said. "They're warning us off. Whoever's behind this, they're watching and they're getting nervous." He handed her a flash drive, encrypted. "If something happens to either of us, it goes to the press." Back at Henry's, things had already taken a darker turn. The front door was open when Cole arrived. No sign of forced entry, no mess, no signs of struggle. But Henry's place had been cleaned. The drawer where he kept the medal had been pulled out and reinserted crookedly. The hidden tag gone, but not the medal. That was lying on the kitchen table untouched, waiting. Cole stared at it for a long time, a chill crawling down his spine. The message was loud, even if it wasn't written. "We know what you're holding, and we let you live." Then he found it, a second envelope, taped beneath the table. Inside, a faded photograph of Henry, Maddox, and Rayburn. On the back, scrawled in old ink, "Only one of us kept the promise." That night, Cole couldn't sleep. He ran the photo through every military database he could access, looking for any connection to the present. That's when he saw it. A blurry background detail in the photo, a signpost, location coded MND C7. He cross-referenced it. It matched a decommissioned logistics outpost deep in the Catskills, government-owned land, officially labeled as training reserve. But Cole knew better. Something was there, and if they wanted to end this, they'd have to go to the place where it all began, or at least where someone thought it should end. Henry, silent as ever, stood by the window as Cole loaded the truck. When asked if he was sure, the old man didn't answer. He just walked out the door, medal in his pocket, and locked it behind him. The Catskill air was sharp, still clinging to the last cold of spring. Cole's truck rumbled up a dirt road that hadn't seen traffic in years. Tall pines pressed in on either side, shadows leaning over the path like they were listening. Beside him, Henry sat stone-faced, the medal resting in his lap. Nancy rode in the back seat, laptop open, recording everything, just in case. They reached a rusted gate, chained shut. Beyond it, through the trees, stood a concrete structure barely visible beneath ivy and moss, the training reserve. It looked dead, but the silence around it felt wrong, like someone was holding their breath. Cole cut the engine. "We go in quiet." Inside, the building was colder than outside. Old fluorescent lights flickered, as if wired to a generator still barely hanging on. Walls were lined with broken lockers, dust-thick floors littered with discarded gear. No sounds, no people, then a door, heavy, steel, with no label. Just a keypad. Henry stepped forward, slower than usual, and placed the medal against the small black sensor next to the keypad. Beep! The door unlocked. Cole froze. "You knew?" Henry didn't answer. He just pushed the door open. The room inside was sterile, a long-forgotten archive, rows of sealed cabinets and metal drawers. But what mattered was on the far wall, a set of VHS tapes, each labeled by hand, along with a cassette recorder that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. Nancy leaned in and read one aloud. "Concordia. Debrief. Maddox. Cole. Hit play. The static buzzed. Then a voice came through, strained, hoarse but clear. "This is Lieutenant Charles Maddox, formerly of Unit Echo 9. If this message is found, I am already dead. They left us out there, not by accident. We had intel on unauthorized opium convoys tied to US contractors, the kind that fund black budgets and bury evidence." His voice cracked. They silenced. "Rayburn tried to silence me. Dorsey made it out because I sent him. I made him promise. If he's still alive, he kept his word." Henry turned away from the screen, eyes wet, jaw clenched. He had never cried. Not once. Not even when the bullets flew or the funeral stacked up. But now he did. Nancy backed up the footage and made copies. They had the proof. But as they left, the silence cracked. Outside, 2 black SUVs were parked by the truck. Men in plain clothes waited, arms crossed, no insignia, just that dead-eyed look of men paid to forget their conscience. Cole stepped forward. "We're not leaving without the tapes." One man smirked. "You really think anyone will listen?" Nancy stepped up behind Cole, held her phone high. "We're already live. One wrong move, and this story breaks in 20 states before you. Take your next breath." There was a long pause. Then the men stepped aside, no words, no threats, because the story was bigger than them now. Back in Albany days later, the footage aired, not on a network but through 1,000 smaller voices, veterans' blogs, digital archives, whistleblower forums. People listened, not all, but enough. Senator Mendenhall never made another public appearance. As for Henry, he never spoke on camera. He didn't need to. He just stood in front of a war memorial one morning, laid the medal down at the base, and walked away. This time, when he left something behind, the world was watching. If this story touched something in you, don't just scroll away. Be part of the conversation. Where are you watching from, and which moment in the story stayed with you the most? Tap the subscribe button and leave your thoughts below. We're here, listening, just like you.